All right, welcome everybody. I had a bit of a snafu for some folks getting in with a password issue, so forgive me if you had a problem. I resent the invitation. So if you know others that are trying to get in, let them know that we resent the invitation with the password. So I have a few people texting me on that, so bear with me while I help. Great. Well, welcome. Thanks for making time today. Sorry we're a little bit late. We had a little technical snafu for people getting in, and so it took us a few minutes to get things straightened out. So glad to have everyone here. We took a bit of a hiatus last time due to sort of give respect and keep our attention focused on what's really sort of up in the forefront for all of us, I think, still even right now, which is the whole Black Lives Matter and social justice movement that's going on throughout the country and the world really right now. So we're back at it here today, and I wanted to give some sort of attention and sort of respect to the fact that I think there's a lot of anxiety within all of us. There's a lot of uncertainty for all of us right now. And so I've woven some of that into what we're going to talk about today and how we might manage that for ourselves as we sort of weave our way through the next several months together as we sort of reemerge from sheltering in place and what that looks like. So today we're going to, I'm delighted to have Mary Gutierrez as a panelist and be interested in some of her insights on a couple things we're going to talk about. Bill Duane is kind enough to join us today, who's a new panelist to us all and has worked at Google for about 13 years as an engineer, senior engineer there, did some amazing work there, and then moved over on his own volition to do work around well-being within Google and really set up a lot of the efforts that are going on right now and to this day with respect to keeping people sane as in Google, and now doing his own consulting work as well for many different nonprofits, including some work with folks focused on AI with respect to thinking about some of the Buddhist principles for how those might apply to AI to inform AI in a way that may create positive rippling through the world in the next decade to come. So thanks, Bill, for joining. And Bill will sort of give some attention to our emotional well-being and spend some time really helping us drop into what we're maybe feeling inside and a bit more of a practical approach towards helping us manage our emotional well-being. So today I want to give a quick update around the statistics, but a bit more condensed since most of us know most of those statistics, I think, because we track some of the news already, and I don't think it helps to spend too much time on them unless there's questions that come up. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about asymptomatic infection and what that's about, and some of the risks to think about around that. And then I want to really move to talking about the environment and what are some of the things we can do in the environment to really make a difference for ourselves to reduce our risk, and some of the research that's come out really around that. And then the next piece is to really talk about traveling. What is it like to travel? Can you travel? What are risks, when you're on an airplane? How can you prepare yourself if you want to travel, given this summer's coming in the fall and people are thinking about coming back to work and what that looks like. And then I want to spend some time talking about the social engagement with respect to quarantine pods. There's a great New York Times article on Sunday talking about this. I was already writing it halfway through because of my own personal experiences, some of which I'll share with you. And what is that about? How do you create a quarantine pod? What does that mean? And thinking about our mental health. And within that, we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about how we might help harness our own sanity. So to start with, I'd like to start with Bill. Bill, if you wouldn't mind leading us to get this webinar started and really helping folks drop in a bit and check in and help us sort of augment our own emotional well-being. That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, so we're going to do like a little mini micro workshop, and I'm excited to share a technique of meditation that's been really useful for me. So we're going to do a little mini workshop on meditation for people who like to think. A problem I had at the beginning of meditation was that I like to think. I really enjoy it. At times, I'm pretty good at it also. You know, actually, I get paid well to think about things and then tell them about what I think. So there was this tension between my mind thinks a lot, and it seemed like that was unwelcome in meditation. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to make friends with your thinking mind, regardless of what it's thinking, and actually use that as a way of meditating rather than something unwelcome that you should shove aside. And part of the reason I really felt that this would be useful is Brad didn't mention, but I'm a member of the Blue Wave family, and that in addition to us being friends and colleagues in some well-being initiatives, Brad is also my doctor. And so I've been attending these things over the last couple of weeks, and all of this information, a lot of it concerning, has really just created this hamster wheel that can spin faster and faster. And I really noticed, especially at the beginning of this, that my hamster wheel, multiple ones were spinning. What about work? What about income? What about, is the purge going to happen? Am I going to get COVID? Or people I love going to get COVID? Lots of hamster wheels spinning faster and faster. And as we all know, thinking through things and examining data is really useful. But I think the big difference is, are we compulsive about it? Right? Are we using this wonderful cognitive ability we have to reason through and think things and make decisions and then take action in the world that are aligned with those intentions? Or we have this sense of autopilot? So I think the first step in making friends with your own thoughts is to realize that we are evolutionarily thinking machines. We are pattern detecting and perceiving machines. And then we extrapolate those into multiple different futures that could happen and adjust our behavior so that we're safe. Neurologically, the parts of the brain, then when we get into these looping discursive aspects, it's called the default mode network. This tends to be very self-referenced, but also social. How am I perceived by others? And it's worth noting that a lot of our apps really get into this endless scrolling, self-centered way. So there's a lot of stimuli in our environment that's actually pitching us towards this compulsive, not very useful thinking. And of course, this takes you out of the moment. The research shows that we're in this wool gathering mode. It tends to be unpleasant. It tends to be self-centered. And if anyone else has been serving in executive roles, this is also the antithesis of what people call presence, of what people call executive presence. So when we talk about bringing mindfulness to our patterns of thought, we can define mindfulness as bringing this sort of present time awareness and curiosity to our thinking patterns. But a quicker and easy way is like getting off autopilot. You know, wouldn't it be a relief to get off autopilot about our compulsive worrying, about the way we show up in work relationships and personal relationships? An example of this is catastrophizing. It was really common at Google, and it was so interesting that multiple people shared this experience of, you try your badge on the door and the badge doesn't work. And you're like, I've been fired. I'm going to get walked out, and then I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage. And then, you know, this catastrophizing, extrapolating. This is an example of being on autopilot. Or we can suppress our thoughts. Maybe useful in the short term, but of course, suppressing our thoughts is a first cousin towards suppressing our emotions. And we all know that leads to 3 p.m. martinis, or your own version of what 3 p.m. martinis are like. And so, of course, when we look at this in terms of mindfulness, of actually having, meditation, which is a practice that enables us to cultivate this concept of mindfulness, a lot of times there's this message that thinking is bad. If you think a lot, then you're bad at meditation. So in addition to that, we throw into the mix this self-harshness. You know, it's a joke when I'm coaching executives. and it's probably true of everyone who's involved in this integrative medicine effort, of like, how often can we turn this beautiful impulse to be a whole, healthy person creating positive change around us, and we turn that into a project of trying to hate yourself into being a better person? So for all these reasons, it can be really liberating to shift our relationship with thought. So what we're going to be doing is actually labeling the thoughts as they come up to have a skillful relationship with them. So for instance, as a thought come up, we might say, oh, planning thought, or judging thought, or worrying thought, or remembering, or fantasizing. And then, of course, we can also then begin to label the absence of thought as either rest or maybe gone. And doing this has three functions. One is we can identify things that may have been sort of below the waterline. Like even though we're thinking them, because it's internal, we might not actually be aware that we're thinking about this kind of thing. Two is we get at arm's length with our thoughts by labeling them as a class of thought. This means we're less likely in the meditation context to get pulled into the thought and end up in this autopilot again. And the third benefit of doing this kind of practice is that it's good data for later analysis. You can say, wow, I really have a lot of planning thoughts. And then later after the meditation, you can sort of use that as good information. Let's go ahead and do an experiment with this. Let's just spend a couple minutes and I'll guide you through doing this kind of practice. So the first thing we can do is find a position to put our bodies that's both alert and relaxed. A phrase I really like is think of your spine like a flagpole, but your body like a flag. Alert and relaxed at the same time. And we can allow our eyes to close also, if that helps sort of simplify things. I always like to start off a meditation period with an intention. So just think to yourself, like, what's your intention right now? This could be making friends with your thoughts, just cutting yourself a little slack. Maybe you want to develop focus, or maybe you're just curious to see if what I was saying is true or not. Anything is fine. So just first thing that comes to mind about what's your intention for this next few minutes. And then letting that go, we can put a root down into the present moment by grounding, by just turning our spotlight of attention towards the sensations of breathing. The in-breath, the pause, the out-breath, the in-breath, the pause, the out-breath. A neat little trick is if you're feeling anxious or wound up or with too much energy, try exhaling a little bit longer than you inhale. And as you do this, you'll note that pretty quickly thoughts of different kinds will arise, taking your spotlight of attention away from your breathing. As this happens, with a real sense of fun and gentleness, label the kind of thought. Judging thought, planning thought, remembering thought. And if you get a little break, you can just say gone or rest. And then gently put that attention back on the breathing. can think about meditation practice as sitting on a riverbank, watching the river go by. In this metaphor, the river is our breath. Just watching it flow. But there's a trick in that. There's an issue in that all these boats keep on coming down the river. Boats and rafts and barges, and all of them different. Some of these boats really grab our attention because they have amazing puzzles on them, begging to be solved. Some of these boats have amazing music and entertainment. Some of these boats have signs with warnings on them. Some of these boats have dancing boys or dancing girls or whatever one's preference is, very compelling. And what happens a lot is we find ourselves all of a sudden on one of these boats. One of these boats is so compelling, we find ourselves just instantly transported and interacting with that thought. Nothing wrong with that. That's the nature of our nervous system to latch onto things like that. But what we can do is, instead of bellying up to the casino boat or dancing with the dancing people boat, is we can just label it as judging thought, planning thought, fantasy thought. And when we do that, we find ourselves transported back to the riverbank, watching the river go by. This is the nature of things, that boats show up on this river from time to time. It's not a bad thing. But just for right now, we're training a quality of being off autopilot about our relationship to the boats. We can do that by labeling them, labeling the boats, labeling the thoughts, and really bowing to them. Nothing wrong with those boats. And it can be interesting when we notice that we've become entangled with a thought, that we find ourselves on one of those boats. Instead of being angry at ourselves for screwing it up, of turning our mindfulness practice into another venue for self-judgment, we can have a little bit of a laugh with ourselves and label even that, and then return to our intention of being more kind, of being off autopilot, of having a healthier relation, whatever your intention was. Because the moment that we realize we're entangled with a thought or we've climbed on a boat, that's a moment of liberation and not failure. This is becoming awake. This is having agency. This is having a choice in how we live our lives. Returning to the sensation of breathing over and over again. Taking refuge and going back home. Judging thought. Anticipation thought. Gratitude thought. And then as we begin to shift from this mode of meditation into the mode of learning and hearing what Brad is going to say, before we let go of this, I invite you to shift to a few minutes of gratitude. What would it be like if we had gratitude for our effed up thinking mind and all the craziness and all the ways it leads? It's trying to keep us safe. Generally, all those thoughts are some manner of, even if it's unskillful, of keeping us safe. So say, thank you. Thank you, crazy ass thinking mind. We can also realize that these practices come from specific origin points. This labeling practice comes from Mahasi Sayadaw and U Ba Khin. Mahasi Sayadaw, a monastic in Buddhist tradition that has been going unbroken for 2,600 years. So even though we're all people generally in North America, in the US, people who have a tendency to have a lot of resources and privilege, our journey on connecting to being with our whole selves is actually directly supported by people in Burma living radically different lives than us and offering up their practice. And they did the radical thing of saying that non-monks should meditate. And they provided these practices to the world that have been taken up right now in the Western world. So in a really direct way, this practice is in solidarity with them, and we're the recipients of their generosity. So if those thoughts soften your heart a little bit, just allow that to happen. And if it doesn't, that's completely fine too. You just note the feeling, maybe even label your reaction to the gratitude practice. And with that, we can just shift maybe for 1 or 2 mindful breaths, returning to the place that we started. All right, so thank you everybody for doing that little practice for me. I know on my thinking mind to-do list, I get to cross off meditate. So thank you for helping me take care of one of my to-do items. And I'll let Brad make the call based on time or not, but I'm also happy to answer any questions if people want to do that through the Q&A or the chat. Maybe as people can add those in, and then when we hit like a pause point to go in there. So if you have any questions or thoughts or reactions about the practice, feel free to put it in chat or QA, and then a little bit down the line, I'm happy to answer those as time permits. So thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That was great. It's nice to be able to settle in. You know, I in my typical fashion, was trying to pack things in and went for a bit of exercise before the webinar, timed it such that I'd get back just in time, and then proceeded to get a flat tire on my bike, and which quickly sort of recovered itself thanks to modern technology, and then came here and had technical issues. So, and then here we are. So there was a lot of anxiety and judgment and all sorts of sort of active monkeys on my back. So there's lots of labeling. So I appreciate the giving us a moment, or giving me a moment to give it some respect and call it out and not be too judgmental. So this is good. What I really like about this approach is it's great for us sort of cognitive-oriented folks that like to analyze things and compartmentalize things. We tend to overanalyze ourselves and then beat ourselves up for overthinking, that we suck at meditation because I can't clear my mind, I can't be calm, and we forget that meditation is actually just about the awareness and the ability to actually notice that you what your mind's thinking and that your mind is thinking, and who is the person that's noticing. Oh, it's me, you know, which then allows me to separate my thoughts from my thinking mind. I mean, my thinking mind from my being. So thanks for that, Bill. So people, if you wouldn't mind, if people want to put questions in, we really, I'd love to entertain those questions. So please do. I'm going to share my screen now and do a little bit of show and tell. Let me just pull that up. So, so today we'll cover a few different things, and the intention behind this is twofold. One is knowledge is power. You know, having knowledge can be really helpful for us when used well, hence the daily practice. So this meditation in my mind is a daily practice, is grounding, and that gives us choice. It gives us the ability to choose to make choices so that we're not run by our emotions and run by what people are telling us to do, for that matter, that we have the ability to have some insight and reflection and can choose to act how we want to act, not how we feel compelled to act because we're being reactive rather than proactive. So with that in mind, we'll run through a couple little statistics just to point out some highlights. And I'll say overall that, you know, these are complicated times. As the coronavirus moves through the globe, we're seeing shifts. And as we open our economies, we're seeing more infections, which will ultimately result in more people getting sick. So this graph really is just saying the Latin America, it's really rolling into Latin America right now. And you could see that Latin America now accounts for half of the global deaths. You know, it used to be, you know, America, this is on a 7-day rolling average. It used to be America was a third, even though we're only 5 or 6% of the global population. We've made up a third of the deaths. And now we have other parts of the world, Latin America in particular, that's really picking up steam, unfortunately. Another view of that is from the Financial Times. I pulled out a couple countries. You could see Chile and Peru in particular, and this is looking at new deaths attributed to COVID, and this accounts for population density. And it's a 7-day rolling average. So you can see the downward trends in Italy, for example. And the reason that that's further out is because they were first impacted earlier than we were, for example, and then Latin America is currently. And so you can see how the trends are. So Peru and Chile in particular are both being hit pretty hard. As we move in sort of, you know, if you think about it globally, many of you have probably seen this now, we're up to 8 million confirmed cases with almost 500,000 deaths, with the United States leading the pack with 116,000. If you remember, the original downward estimate was 60,000, and now no one's talking about the fact that we're doubling that, and no doubt we'll go up to probably 250,000. So if you look within America, these guys, I think it was Twitter, if my memory's correct. No, I forget now which company. A couple of co-founders came off and started creating this reproductive number. And they basically are showing us here above 1 means that, if you remember that within a state, that it's spreading, it's expanding, it's growing. Below 1 means it's contracting. The virus is an epidemic. And you can see the states now that are starting to pick up some steam.
Hey, Brad, there's a request that you present the slides at full size instead of
Oh, or are they not being, sorry, I didn't realize that. Let me,
instead of presenter mode.
try that again. I see. Let's see if this works. Great.
That's great.
Let's see if that's better. Okay, so just to back up so you can see them again. Thank you for the comment. And here you can see the different countries and the different trends. And then globally. And here you can see the different states within the United States. Nevada, Vermont, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Louisiana, North Carolina, Oregon, Washington, Alabama, South Carolina, and onward. Arizona leading the pack right now with the highest, in Hawaii, and Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So if we look at California in the Bay Area in particular, so you can see here 7-day rolling average in California, the top graph, new reported cases. You can see the trending upward, and it's primarily happening out of the Los Angeles area. For all of California, you can see how we're trending upward. And the deaths are flat, but we'll see if that starts increasing because they tend to lag by about a month. United States, we've already talked about on the bottom here. In California, you can see the number of deaths. The Bay Area alone, 505 deaths. Thankfully, we've done pretty well here in the Bay Area overall. And now we're starting to see it pop up in other parts of California, hence 10 times the number of deaths throughout the state versus the Bay Area, which has done a really good job. So those are the statistics, and I think what's important just to keep in mind is, we are opening up, things are happening, and there's just been a decision made that that's what we're going to do, and we're going to accept lives lost, and we're going to accept the illness and move forward. That now the question is, how do we do it in a wise fashion? And so to frame that a little bit, I want us to think about, there's the virus that is not political. It's an apolitical entity. It does its thing. It's about biology. Its job is to survive and to proliferate. And so it will, regardless of your party affiliation, it will infect you. And it doesn't really care about any of the politics. The host is us, and so to keep us as healthy as we can is really important. And then the environment, and how we sort of interact with the environment. So with respect to thinking about sort of the host and the virus, who's walking around asymptomatic? And you probably have heard the statistics, it's around 40-some-odd%. And the reason to think about that is what tends to happen, these studies are done in one point in time, and maybe 40-some-odd%, 43, 44% are asymptomatic at the time, where we go ahead and we sample everyone and we find out people they find out they're infected. They had no idea because they didn't have any symptoms. But that's one point in time, and a better way to say that is that includes people that are pre-symptomatic as well. And if you look at that overall, it turns out we think it's really more around, maybe 15% that are going to be asymptomatic through the entirety, and that most people eventually do develop symptoms. And so that's worth noting. The other question is, are you more infectious or less infectious if you're asymptomatic versus symptomatic? And there's been some studies looking at that now. And it looks like if you look at the bottom here, it says total 1.5% transmission rate versus a 3% transmission rate. So people can still transmit it when you're asymptomatic, but we think it's a little bit less robust. But still, you can. So therefore, how do we be intentional and how do we be intelligent in our design, AC meaning after Corona, meaning like here we are now, we now know this virus is amongst us, And how do we live with it in a way with some intention so that we can be calm and thoughtful and proactive and not reactive? And thank you again, Bill, for that meditation to help ground us. And how do we use our intelligence in a way that invokes wisdom rather than panic? So thinking about our environment and what we can do, and these are sort of the things to be thinking about that I wanted to speak about today. So what do they look like in real form? Like, what are the effects of these masks and of washing our hands and of disinfecting? And again, you've seen this slide before. I just want to bring it up again to say that when you're wearing a mask, you're often protecting others more than you're protecting yourself if you're wearing like a homemade cotton mask. So there's this social contract, like I'm wearing a mask to be respectful for others because I could be carrying the virus and not know it and giving it to others. And so when you see other people not wearing masks, you just need to keep away from them, right? And we'll talk about, are they your friends and you know them or not? We'll talk about that later. But people you don't know, random events, random crossings, you know, it does help to wear your mask to prevent yourself from getting it. But the biggest effect is in others. So that if you cough or you're sneezing or when you're talking, it captures it within the mask rather than it going out into the world. So surgical masks are definitely better than the cloth masks. And nonetheless, you know, if you don't get surgical masks, the homemade masks still work. And you can see that here, right? So if you look at the left-hand side at the T cloth, particles leaked through the mask. So particles produced in the environment and how many come through into your mask. So 33 with a homemade, 25 with a surgical mask, and 1 with an N95. Now, again, the N95s are so uncomfortable to wear, they're suffocating. So it's really not very easy to wear them all day long, and they're in limited supply. So the answer is really surgical masks and cloth masks. And then what about you're producing something from coughing, and how much protection do you get? I mean, do you give to the people around you? And you can see there again. So if you cough and you knock it down by 10%, so 90 particles are released out of the 100. If you're wearing a surgical mask, half of them are released. So it's a huge reduction versus the N95, which again, it leaks out of because there's quite a bit of force from the cough. So there's quite a bit of velocity happening, so it will leak through. So, so the goal is to do this so that in a manner that you have multiple things in play that are each reducing the event. So I'm wearing the mask, you're wearing a mask. Now you multiply both those factors we just looked at and you get further reduction. This is a study that was done that was a meta-analysis, and it really looked at what do we get from each one of these things. So the mask is the middle one, and basically what they showed is the reduction in person-to-person transmission goes from a 17% transmission rate to 2.5%. So it's roughly a 7-fold reduction, which is huge. This is a mix of surgical masks and some were N95 masks. A few of them were regular cloth masks, but most of these were healthcare settings, so they're often more surgical masks and N95s. And then the one on the left-hand side says physical distance, and this was 1 meter, 2 meters, and 3 meters. And you can see even this was 1 meter distance really cuts it down from 13% down to 2.4%. So again, a big reduction. And then every meter further you're away, you get further benefit. It was like a 2x benefit for every meter further away you are, hence the 2-meter rule. So then the certainty of this data, which is what I put up there, is moderate certainty, which is pretty good. It means the quality of all the studies that they looked at to come up with this one point estimate that we call, like how do we come up with a reduction? And then the other two categories here, masks and eye protection, both were lower certainty because the quality of the studies weren't quite as good. But in aggregate, you can see that you get a big shift. Eye protection was a new thing. So eye protection actually makes a difference. All these studies were done in healthcare settings where there was like lots of things flying around, lots of particles, lots of viruses, because we're doing procedures, we're doing there's a lot of activity. People are really sick. They're coughing, they're producing a lot. They're in small, rooms. So, but again, eye protection is important. So hence face shields, even eyeglasses or goggles to think about wearing when you're going to be in indoor environments. So this was another way to look at it with social distancing. And I just wanted to point out that what this shows us here is that the further away you are someone, so you can see on the horizontal axis, 0, 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, the further away, the larger the reduction in your risk, or the lower your absolute risk is overall. So if you're right up close, you can see that for a high baseline risk of infection, let's say it's a 50% risk of infection on the blue line, the blue solid line, it's around 6%. If you're right up close to someone, then you move a meter away, you just dropped it down to roughly 3%. And then you move another meter away, you dropped it down to 1.5%, that 2 meter mark. And then you get some diminishing but continued returns as you move further away. So distance is really relevant. So this is some of the data, which is great to see. And then I showed this several weeks before, a couple of months ago as well. This looked at what's the cumulative effect of like hand washing, wearing masks, wearing gloves, and gowns. These are in healthcare settings. And look at that, the intervention effectiveness in the bottom right-hand corner says 91%. So you get a huge reduction in your chance of getting infected when you do all these things. Now, we're not going to run around wearing gowns and gloves. We don't really need to for most environments that we're in addition to hand washing, but hand washing and masks are really important. Okay, so I wanted to sort of talk about like, these are things we can do. We have control over these situations. We can wear a mask or choose not to. We can wash our hands regularly and not touch our face or choose not to. We can disinfect areas and we can keep our distance from others. So those are all within our control for the most part. I want to switch gears and talk a bit about travel and indoor environments. And to say one note about indoor environments like the office and other things like that, I just want to mention that it's real important to have good air circulation. So if you are in an indoor space, open the windows. Ideally have a window on each side of the building or room that's open so that you get cross ventilation, or you insert a fan in that room, particularly if you're having to go to work or be in places. If you're going out to restaurants, try and do outdoor dining. I don't encourage indoor dining unless they have ceiling fans and have windows open and they really have good air circulation. And even then, I think it's unnecessary at this point. And it of course depends on what county and city you're in. And at every point in time, the risk may go up and down. So my answer to that is just sit outdoors. It's summertime. Take advantage of it. Reduce your risk. So what about airplanes? So a couple different things to talk about. And the concept of, they're going to separate flights and they're going to have people in alternating rows and no one in the middle seat. One of my colleagues, Ethan Weiss, spoke to this and took a picture of his plane. He spent 2 weeks in New York City volunteering in the hospitals, and they flew back 26 UCSF physicians. And that plane was packed, not an empty seat almost. And he took a picture. It was like, really, United Airlines? This is what you're doing? And we're, of all the people that, we're at highest risk. We just spent 2 weeks working in New York City taking care of COVID positive patients. And you're going to pack us in a plane with a bunch of other people. So be mindful, talk to the airlines, choose your airlines wisely, see what they're actually doing. They have guidelines on all their websites. And then, so that's one part of the conversation. The other part is what can you do? So wear masks, wear gloves, disinfect the area that you're in. And now what about the air recirculation and what's going on in the cabin? So I've spent some time doing some research around this, and it turns out that the airflow is pretty interesting. What happens here is air comes into, or let me start with the word exits. The air exits out the bottom, down towards the floorboards, and leaves and goes back to a central area where half the air gets dumped out into the atmosphere, and then they suck in half the air back in from the atmosphere at that elevation, back into the airplane through the actual engines. And then it's very hot because it goes through the engines, and then it gets cooled. And then in cooling, it gets more compressed, which you need it because there's low atmospheric pressure. And then it goes through a filter, a HEPA filter, and then comes back to you to breathe in. So this happens every 5 minutes. Half the air in the plane is dumped out and fresh air is brought in every 5 minutes. So roughly 12 to 15 times every hour, you're getting a complete turn, right? So I should say that differently. 15 to 20 times there's an air exchange every hour. So every 5 minutes, there's an air exchange of 50% of the air that was there. So if you do 2 turns, 3 turns of that, you go from 50% to 25% to 12% to 6.5%. So it's constantly getting rid of the air in the cabin and bringing in fresh air and then pushing it through a HEPA filter. And then you're breathing it, which is actually quite effective, which was great to know. So that's what this air exchange commentary is about. And the filtration, these HEPA filters will filter 99.7% of all particles greater than 0.3 micrometers. And the SARS-CoV-2 is 0.7 micrometers, so it's filtered by these HEPA filters. And so it does quite a good job. The other thing to know is that the air travels in zones for the most part. So it leaves out of a zone and gets pushed back into a specific zone. So it's less likely that someone sitting 30 rows behind you or 20 rows behind you, you're not breathing their air as much as breathing the air within 5 or 7 rows around you. The other piece to keep in mind is these spigots on top of the cabin that you can turn on to have the air push down. And that actually is quite helpful to leave on above your head, because if any particles are floating around you, they immediately, or someone coughed or sneezed, the particles immediately get pushed down, and that's where the exit valves are anyway, and then gets sucked out of the area where you are. Half it gets dumped, goes to a HEPA filter, and comes back. So keep those air nozzles on. If you want to read more about it, I gave you the link here if you're interested. But I would suggest that you sort of think about that. So I was motivated. People are flying. I'm thinking of flying on an airplane. Should I fly on an airplane? A guy named Bob Wachter, who is the chairman of medicine at UCSF, who holds ground rounds every week. And if you're interested in this sort of technical things that I tend to present, some of these slides actually come from their ground rounds. Feel free to do it. To join those ground rounds, you can. They do it every Thursday, and they put them on their YouTube channel, UCSF Medical Center's YouTube channel, by 7:30 that evening, and you can watch them. There's about 10,000 people viewing them per week. If you're into this stuff, it's pretty interesting. And what I think is sort of noteworthy, what he came up with was, because he's 62, he said, my chance of dying, get on an airplane, is 1 in 75,000 chance. Sort of a back of the envelope risk. He didn't take into account actually what I just told you about the air exchange and the HEPA filter. He just did it based on exposure risk and other factors. So overall, I'm feeling more comfortable. Where I think there's still concern is contact, right? So people are touching your seats. You go into the bathroom, it's a small area that people have touched all over. So my advice is bring your own water on the plane. Don't eat, try not to eat too much so you can keep your mask on, and don't need to use the bathroom. For many, particularly women, they drink less water so they don't have to use the bathroom on the plane. So sort of go to your seat and do as little movement as you can, basically. Tend to stay away from the bathrooms where people tend to congregate. Tend to be on the aisle seat, on the window seat versus the aisle seat, so people don't go by you as frequently and as closely. All right. So let me shift to a different conversation. We're up on the top of the hour, so forgive me, we're going to run a little bit late tonight. We'll probably run 10 minutes over. But I want to talk about social engagement. This is going to go on for quite some time. And we can't stay isolated forever, right? We are social beings, and social isolation, we know, increases depression. We know increases health, or decreases our health status. And so how do we do this sort of in a thoughtful, intentional way? So people have made great use of virtual meetings, whether it's through WhatsApp or, Google or Meetup or Hangout or through Zoom or whatever. There's lots of ways now to do virtual meetings, but we are sort of sentient beings that feel people's energy, and it's nice to be in relationship in the flesh in the real world. So how do you do this in a way where you can stay safe? Now, you can do socially distance, wearing a mask and sort of, being in relationship with one another. And adults do a pretty good job at that. But if you try and do that with a kid, they live in the moment and their impulse control is not super sophisticated. I mean, let alone me, for example, my impulse control is relatively jeopardized at times too. So how do you do this in a way that's thoughtful? And so people are starting to come up with some novel ideas, and I think many of us have done this spontaneously. And in the New York Times over this weekend, they sort of put some writing to this. It's worth reading the article where they're talking about this thing called quarantine pods. So what is a quarantine pod? And I think this is particularly helpful for parents that have kids, but I think for all of us it applies. And in my mind, it's like, think of a romantic relationships without the intimacy. Like, you need to have good communication. You need to be transparent in what you want to say to one another. You need to have guidelines and rules. Maybe it's like an open relationship where people like, okay, you're going to be with someone else, but I need to know who that is. And I need to know that you're wearing a condom or whatever these rules are. You sort of need to do the same thing in these pods. And what these pods are is, the idea is, let's identify a couple other groups of friends, or a couple other friends, I should say, that together make a group that we're going to be in a relationship with, and see in a relatively socially distanced, but we're not always going to wear masks. Like, we're going to trust that one another are behaving in ways that we all agree are safe to reduce our risk, and that they're not going to be hanging out with other people. And so we're sort of self-quarantining together, where there's a social contract with one another, that you're going to behave in a way that's respectful and following a social contract, so that you reduce my risk of being infected, because we're going to hang out more closely than we would with other people. The thing to keep in mind about that is, whoever's at the highest risk, for example, I'm a doctor. I, do COVID testing on patients. So whoever's hanging out with me needs to know, I'm at a little higher risk than other people. I wear PPE, I do take the right precautions. And someone may be a grocer, or delivering UPS boxes. So we're at higher risk than folks that are working from home and have much more limited exposure. And whoever has the highest exposure in that group really transmits that risk across the group. So that's important to sort of just be explicit about. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of science is changing all the time. So it's sort of, we got to create rules. So it's a bit awkward. It's a bit evolving, and we need to sort of be able to move together as a pod and have these conversations. So, choosing a pod partner wisely, who's someone that you want to spend time with. Make sure that you both, or all the group of 2 or 3 people, or 2 or 3 families, is really aligned about their version of risk, and have open communication, between the members. And do we make the same sort of judgments and decisions? For example, I go for a run with someone. That's not in the pod. Am I wearing a mask or not? Or I go for a walk. Am I hugging my friend or not hugging my friends? Like, it's important to have all these conversations and be very explicit. Particularly, we're all, and this has happened multiple times now, we're all really exposed to risk. And some of us are going to be exposed. And by no sort of malintention of our own, it's going to happen. We're going to get exposed. So some people say, like, when choosing your pod, this group of folks, maybe do like a 2-week dating trial. Like, are you interested in us? Are we interested in you? Test it out, set some ground rules, and see how things go. Sometimes there's going to be a breach, right? Like, now the way they described it in the New York Times was, we see no one else other than the people in this pod. Maybe that's true. Maybe some people are like, look, I'm going to occasionally see my other friends, but I'm going to do it in a socially distanced manner, wearing a mask, hanging out outside. All that needs to be communicated so that everyone's on the same page. If there is a breach, if maybe there's a potential exposure or known exposure, it's imperative that you communicate within your pod. If you don't, it's a huge transgression, because you're all accepting the risk together. And so accepting that risk comes with the fact that you need to be communicative. And it's gonna happen. You know, people are gonna get exposed. Maybe they made a mistake, or maybe they just were exposed and they don't know why. And they got a phone call that says, hey, you were in contact with someone who's a known positive case. Don't be shy, don't feel ashamed. It's gonna happen to a lot of us, and it's important that you communicate with that pod. So in my mind, the judgment's a big piece of this conversation, and you know, to move from the survival mode, which we can do for a short period of time, to a thriving mode where we're sort of able to be resilient and able to manage these moments of stress that are going to come up where, oh my God, I've been exposed. I need to get tested. Am I positive or not? Can I even rely on the test? If it's a negative, I need to get another test. Who knows about these tests? There's a lot of uncertainty. Do I need to just quarantine for 10 or 14 days? So a real important piece to our sanity is to really taking care of ourselves, our own self-care. So to try and manage that by thinking about your sleep and being in relationship with other folks in a way that's thoughtful and caring, getting enough exercise, you know, eating right, and being in nature is so critical, really. So what I'd like to do for the last few minutes is to sort of answer some questions, see what's come up, and go from there. So we've got a couple minutes left. So one question that was raised is, what about the masks that claim to have inserts that offer more protection to kill the virus? So there are some masks out there that have algae in. I think I mentioned one of them to you before that was supposed to be distributed throughout America. The White House originally put together all these companies, textile companies, to mass produce 600 million masks and get the factories back to work. And they put something called algae in these masks that are copper, and sort of that's supposed to have antiviral properties. In vitro, they seem to have antiviral properties, but they haven't really been studied. So maybe, let's see what the data shows. What I would say is you want a good mask first and foremost. And then if they have something in addition onto it that might be able to kill the virus, great. So much the better. And how to use your mask, to remember when you're wearing them, try not to touch the mask, because then it sort of defeats the whole purpose. Touch the mask, it's your eye, you just infected yourself if you have if you have virus on the mask. Then let's see what else we have for a few other questions that may have come up. So another person asked a question around how do you manage if someone gets infected within your household? So that's a bit more complicated. There are folks that may get infected. Let's say one member is infected in the household. It depends on timing. So, and there's a couple different things to think about. One is, it looks like some people don't infect other people. They actually there's sort of a large group of people, and we don't know why, but they're not super transmissible, transmitting the virus. And then there's these other folks that are super spreaders, that they transmit it to a lot of people. And we haven't sorted through why that's true. We think kids are they're less likely to be a super spreader, kids are, than adults. Again, that needs to be sorted out. So when you're in the family unit, or you're living together, cohabitating with your family or not, it is important to have that one person who is infected quarantined with their own bathroom and using their own utensils, and ideally spending most of the time in their own room. With that said, if it's been in the house for several weeks, at this point, you're most likely to be have been exposed already, because symptoms, assuming they're symptomatic, because you're most transmissible about 3 days before you're symptomatic till about day 5, 6, or 7 of symptoms. That's the window when you most likely transmit to other people. Outside of that window, it dramatically drops off. Any other thoughts from anyone else on the panel? Any other thoughts or questions or anything come up?
I just wanted to thank you, Brad, for a great presentation. And there's so many things that come to mind when I hear what you've said. I know The Atlantic put out a great article about a week ago, and it basically said that the virus doesn't follow any moral code. It just does what it needs to do to survive, and it needs to get inside of us to do that. So that's cool. And then this whole business of social pods is something that I've been having lots of discussions with friends about, and it's sort of turning something into a fun adventure, if you will. I know there's nothing fun about what we're involved in right now, but for those of us who like to take on a challenge, it brings it to a new level. And so I know even with you guys, we've been having discussions about renting RVs, which is something I never imagined I'd do. But now I'm all over the idea of renting an RV and, you know, taking a video the whole way up wherever I'm traveling. It's kind of fun. So anyway, but I think, you know, everything you said is spot on. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gutierrez. Appreciate that. Someone had a question about tests. So I'll conclude with one final question here about how accurate are the tests. If my son gets tested one afternoon, then stays with us, is he safe? So the tests, when thinking about testing, there's a couple different pieces that are relevant. So we're talking about virus now, testing for the virus. The tests are pretty good. The tests that are that take longer to do, ideally like in a Roche-made machine, tend to be really good. There's an Abbott-made machine called the ID Now, which is a point-of-care machine, like Go Health and these other urgent cares have them, and some of the ERs have them. And they basically will do it within 15 minutes. And those are less sensitive, so you're more likely to get a false negative. You may have it, but it'll be negative. You may have the actual disease, but it'll be negative. So they're not quite as good, but again, they're pretty good. And it's hard to give stats on them because they're all over the place. It turns out first the stats came out at 50%. A New York University ER did the study and showed 50%. Abbott themselves said it was more like 80 or 90%. They disagreed with them. So it's still in progress. But what's important to keep in mind is what's the prevalence of the illness in your local community, or specifically in your local pod, because as the prevalence goes up, or as your pretest probability of you being infected goes up, then it's a little bit more concerning. You want a more sensitive test, because if the risk is low, you're a low risk person, and you're in an environment where it's not super prevalent, then the negative predictive value of a negative test is pretty good. Because the negative predictive value accounts for what's the sensitivity, what's the specificity, and what's the prevalence in your environment. So there's a Bayesian approach to this, which looks at probabilities, which is a pretest probability. You think about, like, what's the likelihood you have it? If the likelihood is high, then even if it's a negative test, you're going to say, I don't believe it. If the likelihood's low, I've been quarantining, I've been doing a good job for 10 days, hunkering down, and now I get the test, your pretest probability is low, then the test is negative, you can feel comfortable with that. So unfortunately, it's not a simple answer, but that is how we think about all tests in general, for the most part. It takes into account what's your pretest probability, and what's the quality of the test. And you get these likelihood ratios, which give you a post-test probability of, based on all the information now, including the test, the likelihood that you experiencing a heart attack, having a deep vein thrombosis, that's where a lot of this work was originally done, looking at DVTs, blood clots in particular, because the test wasn't great. So we had to bring in all these other factors to figure out, does this person have a blood clot? Like, do I need to put heparin and really try and thin out their blood? Or can I send them home, or do I have to hospitalize them? So we came up with these things that I'm talking about right now. So this applies here too. It's a long-winded answer, but hopefully the short answer is quarantine yourself for 10 days, reduce your likelihood that you are, get a test, it's negative, then you can feel comfortable. One final question I'll just bring up, since someone just asked it, is about steroids. And I'll say steroids are, in the land of preprints, Just be a footnote for a moment. This is classic craziness. This is anxiety at a systemic level. You know, we're dealing with racism at a systemic level. We have anxiety at a systemic level right now, including the FDA, by the way, which is influenced by politics. The FDA has been EUA, emergency utilization authorization for chloroquine, right? And the U.S. or whatever, some part of the White House related branch directed someone to buy 6 million doses of chloroquine. Now they're going to have to throw them away. What a waste, right? Why? Because Trump was convinced that it worked and was taking it himself. And now the data is showing, actually, may not be working, may be causing more harm. And now there's 2 major papers that were retracted that were published in the New England Journal Lancet. So what's happening here is we're getting all these articles, that press releases made, and that's taken as fact. Or there's the preprint that goes on ResearchGate or medRxiv, medRxiv, which I've barely even heard of before COVID-19. And it's considered published because it's on this preprint. It's not peer reviewed. I could write up an article and throw it on myself, and just anyone could put an article up there. And then all of a sudden it gets peer reviewed and doesn't get published because it's not a good study. So we don't know enough about the quality of this study, this steroid study. What we do know is they're reputable scientists. We know the database is real. We know it's a randomized controlled clinical trial. And we know they stopped the study because the results were so good that they said it wasn't ethically okay to continue giving people on the placebo. We need to give everyone the steroid. So with that said, it looks promising, but we're all waiting now to get have to go through peer review and be published. We can really look at the data in a deep way. All of our 2 lines that we're basing it on, 2 sentences. But it looks like for super sick people, where what happens is our own innate immune system is in hyperdrive, and in trying to kill the virus is actually creating huge collateral damage to the rest of our body. We get this hyper-inflammatory state where you get this acute respiratory syndrome, disease syndrome state. Shutting down our immune system, dampening it down with steroids, looks like it saves lives. It looks like it is a third less likely to die if you're on steroids when you're super sick in the ICU and in that category. It didn't work for people on supplemental oxygen. Like don't need oxygen. So I'm sick, I'm in the hospital, I don't really need a lot of oxygen, but I'm pretty sick. That actually didn't help those people. So it's only when the immune system is actually, what appears, the theory is that when the immune system is in hyperdrive, we need to dampen it down because it's causing destruction, like the Great Hulk running around just causing disaster everywhere, and not being intentional, that we need steroids to sort of shut down the system. Thank you guys for staying a little bit longer.
If I can, I have a way to end that may come at the cost of any sense of dignity I have, but speaks to this idea of masks. Please. So with the beard, my girlfriend, a woman who claims to be in love with me, said, hey, I'd like to make you a mask because every mask cuts across the beard right here, thereby decreasing its effectiveness. And she's handy with a sewing machine. I thought she's going to make me some super cool mask. It happens to be on my desk before I put it away. This is what this person, again, who claims to be in love with me, made me.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, yeah. So, obviously this is not a surgical mask, but it's also not I don't want to do the mistake of leaving the nose uncovered. So yeah, this woman who once again claims to be in love with me, ensuing conversations were, why do you have unused men's underpants in your possession? But this mask was liked 300 times by my Facebook Coal Valley neighborhood group. So I thought that might be a good note to end on.
That's excellent, Phil.
This type of mask, as the people in my neighborhood group, would work because it would keep people at least 8 feet from you, possibly more, thereby encouraging social distancing. So those were some of the comments people had.
Oh my God.
Indeed. And it's good to have a nice little bit of humor. Bill, let's end our session. Thank you, everybody. Bill, thanks again. Mary, thank you. And everyone be well. Stay healthy and sane. Bye-bye.
You as well. Take care.